Hey everybody. So I wanted to show you around chapter 6 in the Heward text and give you a few main ideas that I want you to walk away with. Now, in effort of conserving time, I'm going to recommend that you utilize the pause feature of this video so you can stop and take any of the notes down that you'd like. I really just want to hit on some main topics, and you can pause and that'll give you as much time as you'd like to copy down whatever you'd like. So one of the first things that we discussed when we're talking about emotional and behavioral related disabilities is the controversy in the IDEA definition. Now, we've already established that the purpose of the IDEA definition is to make sure that students are being placed in the right category, so that students are getting the right related services and access to proper resources and everything. But one of the things that we take very seriously in putting kids in the right categories is making sure that all of our criteria is very objective. And usually when it's objective, that means that's two things. It's observable so we can see it, and it's measurable, which means that we can measure it or record it and compare it with previous or future results in some significant way. So I'd just like to take a look at a couple of these definitions and how maybe the language isn't as specific as we might like. Let's say, for example, even on point number 3, okay, inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal circumstances. So I think right there you have two words that are very interesting that bring up some validity issues with that particular point. Do we have an objective understanding of what would be appropriate or inappropriate? Also, secondarily, do we have some sort of source saying when are appropriate, when are normal? What is normal? What are normal circumstances? What does that mean? So, to one person it may mean something. To another person it may mean something else. Now, the one story that we'll say is, okay, the way children are raised, they're raised in the context of the community in which they're being raised, and same thing with schools and with everybody else. So the way that we see and value certain behaviors or the priority on which we observe things over other things may be different than other people. So, and that's great for us, but when we're trying to find an objective definition for something, it's not so easy. So, just another example, a general pervasive mood of unhappiness. So, what's a general mood? That means all the time. They can never smile. They can never be happy. Do they have to be happy? Does that mean that they can't just be kind of neutral? I mean, I was kind of a stoic kid. Would that have been overtly happy enough? But what is the line there? So, anyways, we don't have to go too much into it, but just understand that especially for this particular disability, there are some controversies in the defining of students with emotion and behavior related problems. Now, one thing along with our exclusion criteria on the first slide, the very first point, we also need to understand that emotional disability or disturbance or whatever doesn't have necessarily mean a normal. Once again, we're using very general terms. You could call it a normal maladjustment or something that's not long-term in nature, like an awkward phase or something like that. That wouldn't be considered. But then again, we're also using very generalized words again. So to what extent does a teacher consider a level of awkwardness normal, or is it excessive, or how do we draw the line there? If we had a hard enough time drawing the line with the definition points, yes, this does, it certainly makes a nice point emotionally, but as far as practically, I think this might be hard to operationally define in practice. So, some main definitions for emotional and behavior. Okay, the first thing we need to do is what is emotion and what is behavior? both very unique interpersonal characteristics, okay? Emotion is an internal feeling. It's a state of being of self, okay? You can feel happy, sad, depressed, rejected, uh, all the minor things you can feel, and a little bit annoyed or whatever, to extremely life-defining emotions like loss and success and marriage, childbirth, things like that. So emotion is basically an internal feeling that's a response to a person's place in their environment. Now, behavior is something that is basically external. Okay, and I don't mean external like externalizing or internalizing behaviors. We'll talk about those in a minute. What I mean is that um, emotions do sometimes manifest in behaviors, but not all the time. You can get mad without punching your roommate or your sister or whatever. Okay, you can get sad without breaking down and crying, in the middle of somewhere that you shouldn't do. You can feel jealous without taking revenge, unless he deserved it or whatever. But at any rate, you don't always have to act on emotions. Emotions, we have our own coping processes that we use to deal with our emotions, and we also have some self-awareness to know when we're going from mild to profound emotional state. So behavior, on the other hand, is something, going back to Skinner and Watson and Pavlov. Behavior has to be operationalized, which means that we have to either see it or we have to be able to measure it. Now, what may be confusing to you is we have externalizing or internalizing. What does that necessarily mean to the self or whatever? When we're talking about externalizing behaviors, those are behaviors that are directed towards somebody else. So they're still behaviors. So all behaviors will be observable and measurable in some fashion. An externalizing behavior will be a behavior, so it'll be both observable and measurable action directed at another person. Okay, so that could be aggression, that could be some sort of confrontation. It could be withdrawal or isolation type of behavior, like so and so is trying to avoid somebody else because they know what happens when they interact with that part of their environment. Something bad happens, so they try to isolate themselves from that part of the environment in order to basically interact with it, but with the with their surroundings as a whole better. Now, internalizing behaviors are towards the self. Okay, so they're still observable and measurable. For example, you could do something as extreme as like self-harm. If someone's engaged in self-harm, they will show it, or they will have some sort of, let's say, evidence of it. Okay, so at any rate, although it's directed to the self, it's still an overt action that is a uncontrolled response to emotion. So internal, behaviors towards the self are still behaviors. It's still something you can see and measure, but just directed at the self. Okay. Also, eating. I mean, there are some more invisible ones, but say eating, like eating disorder or something like that. But you could still technically measure that if you could get accurate data as far as eating X amount of times per day, calorie intake or intake, outtake, whatever, like any sort of like medical data or something like that that can help determine or monitor that as well. Now, academic achievement, that's something that it's relatively subjective. Okay, now there's a few traits about students that have emotional and behavioral issues, is that they're going to be statistically more likely to have societal conflicts with either their emotion or behavior. So that could potentially mean a higher incidence of health care use and potential like inpatient healthcare types of programs. It means a much higher incidence with law enforcement. There's also like a higher dropout rates and everything like that. But not to give you the gloom and doom picture, this is something that's absolutely preventable with the right kinds of supports. Some students in school do just fine or better than fine. Maybe in some subjects, maybe in more than some subjects. A student could be depressed but still getting straight A's and be valedictorian or whatever. That student may still need some help for a particular issue that he's having that affects his either academic or functional performance, that we may be able to help him in some way. So making generalizations on the academic achievement of especially this group of students is that's a slippery slope to go down. Yeah, they are more prone to certain risk factors, but there are also cases of students who have profound giftedness and ability in some or many areas. So just take that with a grain of salt, if you will. And we have table 6.1 if you want to look in the book. So once again, you can pause some of this, but here's all the placement data. So you can say that about 1 in 100 of all students, or about 1 in 20 or so of students that receive special education services, are going to be under this label. So it's a pretty big category, but not necessarily the on top tier of size. As you can see, that boys are vastly overrepresented in this particular category, and that's for a number of reasons. Once again, the idea of internalizing behavior, where we do see more instances of girls that are at risk basically manifesting their disability and more internalizing behaviors rather than outward aggression. Not saying that it never happens, but I'm saying just on a pattern, with enough people, you start to see that trend start to emerge. Also, one thing that's interesting in the placements is that you have a relatively low percentage, at least in my opinion, of students that are in the general education classroom. And then this can be due to a bunch of different reasons. Severity of need definitely being one of them. But also, like we said before, with academic achievement, one of the issues of absenteeism and at least out-of-school incidences, either planned or unplanned. You can see that we have, let's say, it could potentially be in a medical alternative school setting. It could be in a corrections type of facility. We have a youth opportunity center in Muncie, which kind of wears quite a few hats in the alternative school needs setting. But we still have a relatively large amount of kids that can succeed and do well all or most of the day in special ed as well. Seeing that 39 plus 19, that's over half. So that's a significant amount. So, what causes emotional or behavioral related disabilities? Some biological, many environmental. So there are some, we do have like chemicals and stuff in our body that regulates how we feel, our mood, our sleep cycle, and things like that. So any of a number of different chemical imbalances in the body could potentially lead to some sort of issue in that particular area. Okay, it could also be something having to do with the actual function of the brain itself, especially parts that have to do with decision making and reasoning and other sorts of action related parts of the brain. But then definitely environmental. There's a very high percentage of students who have been a victim of some form of abuse. I should say it the other way around. Children who are the form and the victims of some form of abuse are just infinitesimally more likely to have some sort of residual, either emotional or behavioral issue as a root cause of the abuse. Okay? You know, that being said, there's other sorts of like environmental risk factors and stuff with if I've seen stats about like seeing gang violence or seeing, you know, drug overdoses or seeing, but basically environment being present during some sort of traumatic or stressful event can cause issues later on, you know, in any of the areas in the definition. But just in general, you know, you could do things like break the ability to trust or to build relationships with certain people or certain types of people or whatever. Okay, because when we think about the idea of memory and our own identity. Okay, we have many memories every day. Some are day-to-day memories. It would be hard-pressed for you if I gave you a random date earlier this year and could you tell me what you had for breakfast? Probably not. I mean, you were there, you ate it, right? But you don't remember it because it was not significant or meaningful. Okay, now maybe if I gave you that date and it was your grandma's 100th birthday, yeah, you might remember that you went to IHOP because that's significant, okay? That has extra meaning to you beyond just the need for nutrition. Oftentimes, some of the strongest memories, or we could call defining memories, okay, can be very isolated incidents, and they could reflect, on average, a very small, you know, fraction of a percent of one's overall memories. But they're so powerful in their few numbers that they can account or represent a considerable high percentage of how that person sees either themselves, how they see their role in their environment, how they see their environment, and how they see the roles of other people in their environment. Okay, so I mean, it's really a person's experiences goes a long way to defining who the person is and how the person feels about you know, specific people, specific things, institutions, or anything. I mean, that's part of the interesting part of how we develop in our own existence. So let's go really quick through this. So you see, this is kind of a common teacher flow chart, and it's not meant to be taken as seriously or anything like that. But you know, how many times have you may have seen the stereotypical power struggle, where it's go from asking to, you know, bargaining to ultimately, let's like confrontation, ultimatum, and then you see that escalation and response from defiance to melting down to, you know, code 5 melting down, until it comes to a head where either something happens or it doesn't happen. And well, this is all too common. This is something that we really want to avoid, especially the multiple steps. If we're trying to, depending on what we're trying to work on, we could probably cut out the majority of those middle steps, okay, and just go straight from you know, command or stimulus, then a said response, and then a said consequence of response. Now, consequence can be both good or bad, so you know, I'm not saying that that's bad. So definitely try not to fall into this slowly escalating power struggle that really no one ever wins. Because if you're trying to power struggle with someone that's literally you could pick up with one arm, it's like 8 years old, you already lost. Okay, even if you win, you lose because you lose by having to deal with that. So how can we screen kiddos? Well, a lot of times, at least for kids that are unscreened coming into schools, this is going to be something for all you gen ed dual majors out there. A lot of it's going to be through your observation. You're going to see things, you're going to document them, then you're going to, you know, try to do a few things like some positive behavior supports right here. Try to do some positive behavior supports to try and help that student succeed in the gen ed classroom, and if not, then you have a sufficient amount of data and evidence of increasing interventions to go and you know, seek a referral or something like that. So you can locate some of these in your book, some of these acronyms. Now there are just an absolute ton of different kinds of screening methods, so just understand that there are, you know, several either observational things or scales or other sorts of forms of observation that we can use to collect data. So just understand that there's a lot of them out of there. And our bottom point, this functional behavior analysis, this is a special ed tool which we're going to be looking at in a little bit more depth as far as a resource we can use. So like I said, the FBA, or the Functional Behavioral Assessment, is something that is done in the special education process when we are trying to understand a behavior, or a cause of a behavior, or just anything having to do with a specific student and specific behaviors. So how it works is they'll come out and they're going to basically do observations. And we can observe in many ways, and we're going to actually do an activity before the end of the semester on observation, so you're going to get an opportunity to do that. So here's some of these words that we use. First of all, frequency, which is how often does the behavior happen. That's pretty straightforward. Duration, which is how long does a behavior last. Is it, is it several minute meltdown? Is it an hour? Is it 15 minutes? Do they get out of their seat for 10 seconds? Or especially for students and you're trying to do off-task behavior, eye wandering or something like that, you may be measuring that in seconds, and that's okay. It really just depends on the context of the behavior that you're trying to observe, okay? Then latency, which is how long basically it takes from the trigger to the actual starting of said behavior. And this is going to be especially true in your ABC coding, where it's like what happens before and then what happens in present, or something happens and then a specific consequence afterwards. Okay, so sometimes you can see, is it immediate? Does it build up? What's the deal with that? Okay, and then so you have either topographical, but basically it's like anecdotal information about what is the behavior operationalized. And then magnitude, which is how severe. It can be level 1, which is, and you can define all these in rubrics. Level 1 could be very minor. Level 5 could just be very severe. You can go to 10, 5, whatever. You can do your own kind of system. So we basically collect all the data, and then we analyze it to try and find a root cause for the behaviors. Okay, so we want to find a root cause to the behavior because we can either eliminate something that's triggering the behavior that's happening before the behavior, or we can change the type of consequence that happens after the behavior in order to basically increase the instances of desired behavior and decrease the instances of undesirable behavior. And that's where this behavior intervention plan, or the BIP, comes into play. So you have more acronyms here. You have the FBA leads into the BIP. Okay, so the FBA comes first. That's not a real thing. And then the BIP. Okay, so sometimes nonsense words help me anyways. So the behavior intervention plan, it's where we take all the data from the FBA, we analyze it, we find root causes of the behavior, then we set a course to design specific interventions, specific strategies, specific practices that are going to address said behavior, and there's going to be specific goals and specific progress monitoring. So you could consider it like a micro IEP goal in a certain way. Well, it's more than a goal because you have the present levels, which is the FBA. Okay, and the FBA also goes into the evaluation of the goal, so it determines, in a certain kind of a way, it determines the scope of what to be worked on. And then you have the goals, progress monitoring, accommodations, and related services and things like that are going to help us meet the goal. So if you think about it, this whole FBA BIP process is somewhat of a microcosm of the IEP process, just in a very specific way. So behavior plans don't have to be just for students that are behavioral issues or have behavioral or emotional related disabilities. It's actually a big move for school-wide behavior plans. And PBIS or PBS, or positive behavior supports, is kind of one of the big ones out there. And as you can see, we kind of have the RTI model of the pyramid with the 3 tiers with the green, yellow, red. Just without getting too far into it, we use positive-based, proactive, decision-making types of learning situations, okay, as far as handling behavior, handling conflict and resolution of conflict. Once again, trying to depersonalize behavior from people, focus on positive affirmation, and view behavior instances in a teaching learning experience as opposed to some sort of more of a confrontational authoritarian experience. So we have our 3 tiers of the green tier, tier 1, everybody, we use good positive based strategies for everybody. And then you have the yellow tier, which is kind of like tier 2 of RTI, where you're going to have students work on specific skills in small groups. And then the red tier at the top is going to get some intensive one-on-one, maybe even out-of-class supports for working on whatever it is that they're trying to work on, so they can have more specialized, individualized support. And we can measure the progress, and we can send kids through up and down the tiers depending on the data that we have. So a few things on classroom management. You guys will have a classroom management class when you take 266, maybe even next semester. So you're going to learn all about that. But as far as some things that Heward wants you to take away with, the idea of clear expectations. And clear expectations means equal enforcement, okay? Because if a student realizes that if they can get away with something, right, it will be tested and students are observant. So if someone's tested something and you don't basically comply with your expectation, not only does it undermine the precedent for that particular behavior or rule or whatever, it just kind of undermines your credibility in general, because you know that you're not going to follow through on what you say you are, and that's not a good position to be in. Now, don't take the idea that you shouldn't be students' friends out of context. You should definitely try and build a relationship with your students. You can be friendly towards your students in appropriate times. The idea of this is that you don't want to have the mindset of they're your friends, because when you have, just imagine your friends, you try to keep on good terms with them, so you won't, sometimes you might toe tap around difficult conversations, you'll take special considerations, which can affect the overall consistency of the whole idea of classroom management. Also, the other way around is that friends know that they can take liberties with their other friends, that they're not going to get called out on it. At least, if maybe just obviously there's a line for everybody, but maybe if I just push it this far, okay, let's try just a little bit further, until you see kind of the friend give, the wiggle room zone. So the mindset for both the student and the teacher is kind of out of whack, okay, if either or both have the friend mentality, because friends don't want to get on other friends if they don't have to, and also know that special rules apply for special people, and that's okay in the context of actual people in your life. But when you're trying to run a classroom, that's dangerous, just for the credibility of your management system. And then, of course, don't take it personally, right? So you have a student that might be acting, wrong or bad or whatever. Even if the person isn't maybe necessarily your biggest fan or whatever, you definitely can just brush it off a little bit. Also understand that there's a million different reasons why little kids could be either upset about something else or worried about something else, and just directing their frustration towards something that's affecting them in their life towards you because, I don't know, it's just their way of coping. So yeah, don't beat yourself up over it if it does happen. So anyways, just some quick takeaways from chapter 6. Here's a couple pages that you want to take a look at for your terms. And it can help. These are going to help you also with your guided notes as well. So mark these down, and that'll help you with your chapter 6 guided notes for sure. Okay, so like I said, I didn't want to take too long, but I wanted to hit some of these main parts of chapter 6. The 5-point definition with some of the vague language. We talked about the controversy of specific language and observable behaviors. We talked about the difference between behavior and emotion. Emotion's on the inside. Behavior is a discrete action because it has to be seen and measured. We talked about internalizing and externalizing behaviors, talked about not generalizing academic achievement, although there are some risk factors. We looked at our prevalence data. We saw a little bit over half students can participate either some, most, or all of the day in general ed, but there's a whole bunch of different placements for different needs. We talked about all the different factors. It could be biochemical, it could be environmental, it could be, especially as a response to some sort of trauma, abuse, or something else. We talked about don't let this happen to you, don't be this person, okay, because power struggling with a child is nuts. Even if you win, you lose, because you had to spend all that effort, power struggling, that's not good. Screening, if the students don't already come in with a diagnosis, it'd be through any of these different scales, and there's a ton more where that came from. Or we can use a functional behavioral analysis or an FBA for screening, which is basically we understand and we operationalize the behavior, how often, how long, how intense, and we could tell, we could verbally operationalize what comes before, what comes after, and try and draw some patterns through narrative and things like that. And then you come up with the behavior intervention plan, which puts all the analysis from the FBA into motion. What specifically do we do? What kind of services specifically are we providing? What is the actual way that this is going to happen? And then we got our positive behavior supports. You can see it's multi-tiered and it's school-wide because behavior intervention doesn't have to be just for kids that have problems. Okay, behavior intervention is good for everybody, and this kind of takes an approach that way that everybody is worth being considered in this discussion. And then just some basics on classroom management about clear expectations and consistent enforcement, that you need to see them as a student, although you can be friendly to them, that you need to see them as a student for professional reasons, and being able to maintain what you have. Is making sure to spend time, and also don't take bad behavior as, since they're personally trying to, it's not personally directed towards you, because it very well may not be. There's a lot of things that could be going on. So anyways, I'm going to be around this weekend if you guys need some help with any of your stuff. Please make sure that you're talking to me before things become a problem, because a lot of times I can fix stuff rather than have you trying to look at something for 2 hours and then come to me and say, I haven't been looking, I don't know. And I feel bad that you spent 2 hours looking when I could have just pointed you in the right direction in 10 seconds. So at any rate, come to me if you need help. Anything you need, let me know, and I'll see y'all next time.